Welcome back. This is nice. Okay, we have been looking forward to this moment for a very long time. So I want to start by saying that several years ago, Brooke Wirtschafter, our amazing director of community organizing, came to me and said that the leadership of Minyan Tzedek, our justice warriors in the community, decided that it was really important that we build real relationships with our representatives in government. And so we started a series that we've been doing over lunch for now many years, and we've had incredible opportunities to hear from members of Congress, from our mayor, from city council members, from congresspeople, from senators, and it's been wonderful. And we realized that we have to meet each other where there's alignment, and we have to make clear to our representatives what our priorities are, where there's not, and also to hear from you what matters to you, so that we as a faith community that's deeply committed to justice can also help pursue the greater good along with our electeds. So I'm really grateful to this community for your open-heartedness and our willingness to listen and to engage and to learn. And this is a particularly wonderful lunch and learn because we've been trying to get Representative Katie Porter here for quite some time. I do want to say that we had Representative Adam Schiff here. Over the years, he's actually come many times. And we also put out an invite to Representative Barbara Lee because what we're not going to talk a lot about in this conversation is the ongoing race. But I do want to make it clear that we're happy and thrilled to have all of our wonderful candidates here. But let me give a brief introduction to a woman who does not need any introduction, but I will anyway. Congressperson Katie Porter represents the 47th District in Orange County, California. I don't know if we have anybody here who's actually in your district live, but I know we have many people who are watching the stream and will watch afterwards. In Washington, Representative Porter remains committed to putting families first and to speaking truth to power. As a member of the House Oversight Committee, she has asked tough questions of bank CEOs and administration officials to hold them accountable to the American people. You are a proud member of the House Natural Resources Committee, where you work tirelessly for our environment, for our public lands, calling out big oil, taking advantage of taxpayers, and keeping families safe from wildfires and other natural disasters that we're particularly concerned about here in California. I know that you are a member of the bicameral Joint Economic Committee and a leading voice on keeping our economy strong and stable and globally competitive. And the way that you do that is by cracking down on corporate greed, boosting competition, and investing in smart family-friendly policies. And we are very grateful to you for all of that work and so much more. Many of you know Representative Porter for her whiteboard, which is one of the great innovations in Congress in the last couple of decades, which you can't use today because it's Shabbat. But I just want to say that what we have witnessed as we've watched you take people to task and speak truth to power over the course of the past several years is how an educator actually thinks about transforming the public discourse. And I know that that's important to you as someone with an education background, but it's important to us because you're teaching us. And you're teaching the broader public about why the policies that might be instinctive or counterinstinctual for us actually just make good sense and are just fair and just and right. And we're deeply grateful for all of that. This is a very long list of achievements and accomplishments, which I'm not going to read, but I also do want to add that as a single working mom, you have really made your voice heard, and we're deeply, deeply grateful for your leadership in that space and the voice that you've given to so many people who I think before you felt like literally nobody understands what I go through on a daily basis. And now we look at you and hear you and we feel more deeply understood. And I think I'm speaking for many, many people in this room. So I thank you for being here and very grateful for your time as both congressperson and a mom of 3 kids. It means a lot that you're willing to spend your Shabbos lunch with us. So welcome and thank you for being here. So I'll start by saying that as a Jewish community, as a faith community, we are really committed to constructive and consistent civic engagement. And we actually see it as part of our moral obligation as a spiritual community to engage in the work of building democracy and sustaining our democracy. This includes voting in every single election. We have a 100% voting commitment as a community. That's hard because sometimes we're like, oh my God, is today an election day? And so what we try to do is not take people by surprise, but help prepare. We have phone banks. We really insist that people become knowledgeable about the issues that are before us, really forging relationships and fighting for legislation that we think reflects our values. We also have been collectively deeply worried about what we've seen over the course of the past several years as an evisceration of our democracy. And I just want to start by asking you to reflect on the state of our democracy right now and what you see as the greatest threat to our democracy, and where do you see the greatest promise?
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me, for the lovely introduction, for the delicious lunch, and for a chance to be part of your community. I'm glad you started with an easy question, like a warm-up and a softball, and I think it really is true to what I've heard over the years from so many wonderful members of the IKAR community about how deeply you engage in thinking about the challenges facing our country. So I think democracy, both here and now in this moment, and in general as a system of government, is fragile. I think it is inherently fragile. I think that is a feature, not a bug, although it can become so fragile as to fall apart, right? That's always the difficulty in fragile things. How do you handle them? How do you live with them? How do you be part of them without destroying them? And I think we're in a time where we're asking ourselves that. But I think it's important for us as Americans to recognize that democracies around the world right now are struggling. And Trump in so many unfortunate ways was exceptional, like exceptionally bad. And so I think it's easy for us to lose sight of the fact that actually democracy worldwide is struggling. And the really hard thing about democracy is the sustaining of it. Right? And so for me, for example, the hardest thing about President Trump getting elected was that I had to come to terms with the fact that we, as Americans, did that. And so in that moment, I think there were so many people who said, I didn't vote for him. I phone banked for Hillary. I knew he was gonna be terrible. I tried to talk my cousin Bob into not voting for him again, like not voting for him. But what it means to be part of a democracy is to acknowledge the really hard truth that our fellow Americans, whether you think the election was stolen or the reality is you can't eliminate the tens of millions, 100 million votes that were cast for him. And so I think that is the sort of most painful part of democracy. So when people ask me, why can't we pass this or that policy that they feel like everybody is in favor of, the hard answer is because it's a democracy. And that doesn't always get us to the right answer or the just answer, because it's a political system that is based on our own human foibles, right? Our fears, our anxieties, our prejudices, our hope, our compassion. Like, these things all go into that stew of democracy. And so we are all kind of partly responsible for it. I think what gives me the greatest pause about where our democracy is going is, and I'm really very focused not on where it has been. That is, it's easy to say, well, it's better now than it was under President Trump. Low bar, people, low bar. That cannot be our standard for who we want to be as a country. Better than Trump does not satisfy my soul and my sense of what I want for the world. So I think the really hard part for me right now is I'm the mother of a 12-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 17-year-old. And the thing I think the most about is how deeply shaken their faith is in democracy. And when we talk about the future of our democracy, I think that politically, today, a younger voter is a voter under 50. So when people say, like, I lead in the polls with younger voters, they're not talking about 19-year-olds. They probably lead with the 19-year-olds too, but we have an entire generation, 2 almost generations of people who have only known a democracy in which citizens united was the law of the land, in which presidents broke either laws or displayed conduct that we might think is immoral, whether it's personal conduct or political conduct. And so, you know, my one son said to me, Mom, it's a good thing I can't vote in your Senate race. And I said, well, why not? And he said, well, because I wouldn't vote for you. And I said, well, who would you vote for? I mean, I have to have a lot of these conversations. It's a great race. We have great candidates. And so I said, well, who would you vote for? And he said, I wouldn't vote for anybody, because nobody understands that if you want to fix it, you have to burn it all down. And this is my son, and I reveal this to you because it really shows how much work we have to do to repair and restore confidence in democracy. And so I think one of the things I would challenge you all with personally in your lives, as well as in your sort of collective work, is to really don't dismiss younger, again, put your own definition on that. I mean, a Joe Biden younger voter is a voter not on Medicare. Okay, so I mean, it's a real challenge for the Democratic Party. Really challenge you to deeply engage with them and do not dismiss their skepticism. Be empathetic to it. Think of the world that they have known, which is a really different world. Like, many of you were part of the civil rights movement. You were part of powerful moments in which this country did great things and created opportunity for people. The GI Bill, college tuition in California being free, the passage of the Endangered Species Act. And then ask yourself, what do young people have to anchor to in government? We have to give them things. Or that is, I think, where our democracy is in peril. So it's really, how do we engage that future generation? And I'll tell you, you're not going to get there by being dismissive and telling them they'll understand it when they're older. Maybe they will, and maybe they won't, right? But really take to heart, they are skeptical of our democracy because of what they have seen and what they have experienced. And I think we need to listen to them about how we're going to restore confidence in it.
Yeah, that's so interesting to think about the impact of that administration on our children's understanding of what politics looks like, on really the whole generation. I remember he gave a speech very early on in his presidency where he was talking to a group of like 12,000 boys. Maybe it was a Boy Scout gathering.
That was one of the let me say, I was a Boy Scout leader at that time. That was one of the most horrific things President Trump ever did, was talk to 20 or 30,000 young men, and the things that he said make my blood run cold.
I remember hearing it and I thought, what's awful about this moment is that it's a culture-shaping moment, and that it's going to take generations for people to change their perception of masculinity, of power, of partnership, of relationship. And I think it did impact a generation in a pretty profound way. You answered the first part, but I'm going to push you to answer the second part also, which is, where do you see the seeds of hope for our democracy, given what you just said?
Yeah. So I think I was part of the class of 2018 that was elected in the wake of Trump's election. My classmates were and are, and I'll tell you why I use the past tense in a second, were and are transformative, potentially, of our government. Now, I use the past tense because roughly half of us will no longer be in Congress by the end of this coming Congress. That's the sort of casualty rate to losing tough races, to finding Congress unbearable in different ways, both personal and political, to not having an institution that really supports the public servants who are doing this work and kind of gives them opportunity to grow. But that class of people, we were different. And everybody who is, when they first told me that when I got elected, I was like, I don't know, we look pretty ordinary to me, right? But then I got into Congress and I started seeing who typically populates that place, and we were different. And I think that keeping those people's voice, keeping them there, keeping those people's voices lifted up, keeping it strong, because these are people who came into democracy at its lowest moment. They stepped into the breach of the post-Trump moment, and I think that collectively, and I think about so many of my colleagues when I say this, there's kind of an energy and a willingness to confront just how hard this is. We don't put a shiny gloss on it, right? We don't say, well, soon it'll be back to the way it was. It's not ever going back to the way it was. It doesn't mean that the future can't be bright, but to be clear, to me, the way Congress was 20 years ago was a Congress where I couldn't even have served. A Congress where I could never have gotten elected, where so many of my colleagues, the first Native Americans, the first lesbian mothers, the first, that wouldn't even have been elected. So I don't want to go back to that. I think the people who are willing to envision a different political future are the ones that give me the most hope. And so that's everything from activists to people working in community to people who are currently in office. But I think I really would push everyone to have that forward mentality and to be careful how much time you allow yourself to spend. However good the good old days were for you, that I think the moral task on all of us in our democracy is to think about how great the next days can be. And I think that this election and the election of President Biden, like there was kind of a longing for the past that was understandable. But I would say I've actually been really inspired by President Biden about how forward-thinking he's been on some things. And I'll give you one example. I never thought that the president who most deeply understands caregiving work, the importance of caregiving, what it means to people's mental health or economic potential would be President Biden. That just wasn't on my bingo card. He's older, he's a man, he's white, and there is no president we have ever had who understands caregiving and is passionate about it more than him. And we have a Congress who can't quite catch our 80, whatever he is, year old, I don't even know how old he is because I don't care. I'm voting for him. I can't even, who can't catch up to this person who is so visionary about caregiving and caregivers, both for elderly and seniors and others. So to me, seeing what he's done in his presidency and how he has changed and sort of been willing to say that he was wrong and to rethink and to continue to learn is really inspiring.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to come back to that point about empathy in a couple minutes. And let me just say that I know a lot of folks here, for many of us, Israel-Palestine is really top of mind, and I am going to ask you about that, but I want to talk about that at the end and not the beginning, because the work that our community really invests in on the day-to-day is work in climate justice, racial justice, housing, economic justice. So I want to make sure that we don't back burner those things that are part of our really daily important work, even as this terrible war takes so much of our head and heart space. I want to talk about housing. So there's in the Torah, there's a line that talks about the Jubilee, the 50th year, and it says, "Ukratem dror ba'aretz," and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land. And the word dror is an interesting word for liberty. It's not the most obvious word for the Torah to use. It should have said something like chofesh, chofshi, but instead it's dror. And the rabbis make this little drash, this little sermon, and they say the reason why is because dror is connected to dira. Do you know what that means? Apartment or house, right? And that you cannot have liberty, you cannot have freedom if you do not have a home. And so we, as our community has grown, and we've contemplated what it would be like to pray not in a basketball gym. And over the course of time, we were able to purchase a property, and we're in the process of developing and imagining and raising money for this incredible platform for a home-free IKAR, platform for multi-faith justice work. And we made the decision as a community that we were going to also use that space to build 60 units of permanent supportive housing on site. This is awesome. And I really am very thankful to Melissa Balaban, our CEO, and Michelle Rosenthal, and Brooke, and many of the people who are in this room for advancing this. I mean, this is like a full-time job. This is part of the problem. It shouldn't be a full-time job to be for when we have the land, we have the community, we have the partner, and we know we have the people who need homes, and it's excruciating. The process is multi-year. There's so many barriers to building housing. Why is that? And what can we do to sort of grease the wheels or loosen I don't know what the right expression is, but to make it so that we can actually address this crisis? Because for many people who are living on the street, every day is a crisis and a trauma, and we just have to be responsible about taking care of it. And we have this like yes in our backyard mentality, and we still are having trouble getting it done. So can you tell us from your vantage point, what could or should the government be doing differently to make really good, affordable housing available to every single person in this country?
Okay, so let me give you a one-word answer. So she asked, what should the government be doing to make affordable, good quality housing available to every American? Try. And the reason I say that is because for 30 to 50 years, the federal government has largely abandoned that as a policy goal. You used the phrase, Rabbi, grease the wheels. And I'll tell you, I use that phrase when I talk about housing too, and let me tell you how. Did you know there's not a housing committee in the US Senate or the US House? There's a banking committee, and housing is a subcommittee of that. And doesn't that tell you what you need to know about how Washington thinks about housing? Housing is there to sort of grease the wheels of profit for Wall Street. Housing is more than a financial thing. It is, as you note, it profoundly affects virtually every aspect of your well-being. Whether you have clean air, clean water, whether you have job opportunities, whether you're safe in your community, whether your kids, the kind of education they're gonna have. And where does Washington locate this? Is Wall Street humming along? Is the money engine going burr? That is a really important starting place. So I'm gonna give you some very specific examples of housing policy, but I wanna start there, which is the federal government for about 50 years has pointed the finger down at the state governments, which have pointed the finger at the county, which points it at the city, and then everybody wonders why we've gotten here. This is not a problem of the last 2 years. This is not a problem of the pandemic. This is a problem 50 or 60 years in the making. And so the first thing I would say is the federal government needs to own this problem. I said this to one of my California colleagues. I said, well, what do you think about the Democratic Party platform on housing? And he said, do we have one? And I said, right. That's my point. So even now, even today, as you have people come to your lunch and learn, when they hear a question about housing, they will talk about homelessness, which is, and particularly street homelessness and chronic homelessness, which is the most acute, painful, and visible part of this crisis, but it goes so much deeper than that. The truth is, most Americans who do not already own a home and will not inherit one, are not able to afford one. Most, not just in California, not just in Orange County, across the country. I gave a talk at UC Davis in February, and I asked, this is UC Davis, it takes a 4.0 basically to get into Davis today. And I asked the group of 70 graduate and undergraduate students, how many of them expected to be able to buy a home in California in their lifetime? Not a hand went up. Wow. Now, we can debate whether they're too pessimistic or they were just a shy bunch, but the truth is, even if they're wrong, that is a huge problem of community and of politics for us. So the first thing I would say is the federal government needs to say the home ownership crisis is a crisis of federal policy. This is not to let off the hook. And I represent some of these charming communities like Huntington Beach, Localities that have failed and blatantly disregarded affordable housing ordinances. There is blame to go around at every level of government. But this is a crisis in which the number of zeros and the level of imagination it's going to take to get us out of it must have a federal component at its core. And so this is my number one issue. When I went to run for the Senate, people ask me, they always want you to know your top 3 issues. I don't know what's magic about 3, but I always would just respond with 1, housing. Because it is without solving this, we cannot solve problems like income inequality. We can't actually address climate justice. We're not going to be able to solve, the problems of recruiting workforce and being able to be competitive in a global economy if we can't house our communities. Let me give you some specific examples of what's wrong. There's currently a rule that the federal government, HUD, FHFA, cannot finance the construction of 1 to 4 units, so think low to moderate density, the kind of housing that is very palatable in virtually any community. They can't finance the construction of those housing units for sale. So that's why they're not getting built. That's it. They'll finance the construction of them for rental, but the government cannot finance the construction of 1 to 4 unit residential property for sale. And that's exactly the kind of housing we need a lot more of. A lot more duplexes and 4-unit buildings and sort of 3-story complexes. We need everything. We need ADUs. We need all of it. We need senior housing. We desperately need housing for people with disabilities. But the government literally, we have to backstop this. If we let Wall Street build what it profits from, we will not end up with the right mix of kinds of housing and the affordability of housing that we need. It isn't that Wall Street won't be part of this, but the federal government is going to bound and put the contours on and incentivize Wall Street to build what we need, not what it profits from the most. And when I explained this to someone, they said to me, it was actually in an event here in LA, hosted by some IKAR members, someone said, well, but Representative Porter, I don't think the federal government should be involved in housing that way. And I said, well, may I ask, sir, about your mortgage, if I may be so bold? And the person said, well, I put down 20% and I have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. He said very righteously. And I said, well, guess what? You have a mortgage that exists only because the federal government backstops it. So you, sir, are exhibit A for why the federal government needs to be involved in housing. They're involved in your housing. They're involved in housing for people who can afford to put 20% down. What they haven't been involved in is really actively creating meaningful, good quality housing for people who can't. I'm a big fan of exploring shared appreciation models, which is, the idea is that you purchase the house and somebody owns, you purchase part of the right to the appreciation. You get the right to live there permanently, and you get the right to all the rights that come with painting the walls and making it your own. But as the property appreciation grows, that is shared between the entity who helped you get into that home and you. I think that's important. I'm a big fan of land trust development. I myself, somewhat controversially, live in housing like this. I own my house. I don't own the land it sits on. I basically live in a non-movable, trailer house, sort of. I mean, it's actually a very nice house. It's stucco, but the idea is that I don't own the land, because the land needs to be permanently and forever available for workforce housing for people who work at the University of California, Irvine. It's an incredibly innovative model, and it works really, really well. So we need to have a lot more innovation at the federal level. So when I say a big federal investment, I do mean one with lots of zeros, but I also mean a big investment of imagination. And there are things that work locally. There are heroes and people and developers and builders who have these tools and ideas and innovation, and they are hamstrung by the fact that we have no federal rules. This is all left to a real tangled mess of county and local and state, and it is a thicket. It is virtually impossible to get through, and that adds a lot to our cost of housing. So we are gonna have to streamline how we're going to build this next housing. And the best way to do that, streamlining without eviscerating quality, without allowing discrimination to flourish in housing markets, which is what will happen if you remove all regulation, shoddy construction, dangerous construction, is to have the federal government sort of take over some of that regulation. So it's one-stop shop. If you qualify for this federal government affordable housing project, this is your list of rules. It's all here. There's one person you call to do it. The last thing I'll say, and I was talking about with one of you before this, is I think we need to rethink who's actually in charge of housing. Does anybody know what agency is in charge of housing? HUD, maybe. FHFA, VA, Treasury, you see the problem here? This doesn't work because everybody points the finger at somebody else about who's, even at the federal level. And I think even wedding together housing and urban development has kind of cramped how even HUD understands what its role is. Like, what about the extreme dearth of quality housing for our farm workers in rural areas? How does that fit into urban development as a mission? It doesn't, and so then HUD looks the other direction often on that. So this is my number one passion. I got my start in public service, working on housing issues. I did research exposing how the mortgage companies that cheated people into subprime loans they could not afford were then cheating them on the way out when they were foreclosing on them. And so this is my passion, and this is California's number one issue. I believe this is our economy's number one issue. It must become Washington's number one issue.
Thank you. I really resonate to your passion about this, and I'm thinking about how many number one issues I have. I think I have like 8 number ones. But one of my number one issues, and something that I think we are deeply invested in as a community, is climate justice. And over the break, I read an incredible book written by my friend Brian McLaren, who's a pastor who wrote a book called Life After Doom. And he essentially lays out the 4 possible scenarios of what the climate catastrophe could look like. And let me tell you that the best possible scenario is really terrible. And that's if we totally get our act together and we do every single thing culturally, legislatively, but politically, socially that we can, and we're not. So I want to talk about that with you for just a moment, because there's so many things we want to touch on in our short time together. I mean, obviously, the climate legislation is really a very significant win, and also we know that it hasn't turned out to be all that everybody hoped that it could be. And so I wonder if you can share with us some of your thinking on what is being done through which pieces of the bill do you think are the most significant, and what else could be done at this point of really the 11th hour, this moment of great urgency to address the climate crisis with the amount of resource and energy that it deserves, so that we can hope for some kind of future for our children and grandchildren.
Yep. So I would say that one of the arguments that we need to be mustering kind of politically is to help people understand, including people who are concerned about the cost of all this, about the trade-offs between working on climate and working on other problems that we have in this country, is this only gets more expensive. The cheapest time to fix climate change is today. It only gets harder and more expensive, and there are fewer good options if we let it keep going. So unfortunately, I would say climate and Washington's approach to climate is really a perfect illustration of what I believe Congress's motto is. Solving yesterday's problems tomorrow, maybe. That's really where we are with climate. This was a yesterday problem that we are trying to solve today, and maybe we're gonna get there. One of the challenges with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really the big climate green energy legislation, is that most of this stuff is multi-year. And you cannot fix a 50-year, 70-year, 80-year addiction to fossil fuels and pollution in a 4-year presidency. Right? You can't fix it when Republicans take back control of Congress and spend, as they did this last year in the House, and spend all the time trying to unwind every single hearing in natural resources. Well, that's not quite true. There's one exception I can think of, but virtually every single hearing in natural resources is about how to unwind some aspect of the Inflation Reduction Act. The others are about, ready for this? How to kill endangered species. Like how to kill more grizzly bears. Did you know that that's a priority for the American people? That was actually an actual hearing we had. I was like, I cannot believe, sometimes I just want to poke my eyes out. I could not believe that that was their priority, right? Trying to kill more species that we have managed to recover. So I think that for me, the most exciting part about the Inflation Reduction Act is that it takes aim at all different levels. So for too often we've thought about climate as a household issue, climate as a business issue. This really touches on all of it, and I think that's important. I will say that some aspects of the implementation have left a lot to be desired. So at a hearing recently, I told a story about a constituent who wanted to get a heat pump. And they live in an area where it's getting warmer and warmer. Houses didn't traditionally have air conditioning. A heat pump also keeps you cool, confusingly. And they wanted this heat pump, and when is it gonna be available? And this constituent voted for the Inflation Reduction Act. It's me. And I still can't figure out how to get this and what kind of rebate or credit or where I go or how I apply. And if I can't figure this out, how do you think everybody else is doing? So it turns out, I think I figured out the answer, I think, by reading some IRS publications, which I know is what every American likes to do. When we have a world and a country in which the functional reading level is 8th grade, I think definitely spending time at irs.gov is how we're gonna get people to purchase these energy efficient appliances. So there have been some really lumpy aspects of this. One of the other ones that concerns me is I think we have not understood the real permitting reform challenge. So permitting reform is a Republican phrase that we need to take back. So I urge you all to become evangelists for permitting reform and to own that phrase and to give it its proper meaning. For Republicans, permitting reform means making it easier for fossil fuel companies to drill anywhere and everywhere they want for as long as they want speculatively. That's what permitting reform means to them. But don't let that blind you to the fact that we desperately need permitting reform, because what we need to do is have easier permitting to build more electrical transmission. So the places that are going to generate the green energy and the clean energy are not going to be the same places that the wind, the solar, they're not in the same places as the fossil fuels are. And so we have to have many, many more electrical transmission lines and interstate transmission projects. So that is, I think, I would like to say that's low hanging, but I will tell you that Republicans oppose this. But that is the permitting reform that we really are going to need to unleash, because even as we're building and investing in wind farms and solar and other things, if we don't have the ability to move it around and we don't have the grid to store it and keep it stable, we're not gonna be very successful. And I think it's an intentional strategy by the fossil fuel industry to basically try to doom these forms of energy to not being stable and not being easily to move. The other thing we haven't tackled in Congress is, look, we have to end the tax subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. They have to play by the same set of rules as green energy. So what you hear about is all the so-called subsidies to green energy. The truth is they're not even a fraction of the tremendous tax subsidies we have given decade after decade after decade to fossil fuels. So I'm really proud that my legislation, which was part of the Inflation Reduction Act, raised the royalty rate, what fossil fuel companies pay when they drill on our public land. It hadn't been raised in 100 years. So it was way more expensive to drill on Texas state land. than it was on our federal land. Wow. That's how far out of whack our federal policy had gotten. So I think we have to put them on a level playing field, and we have a long ways to go in order to be able to do that.
That's devastating, because we know that even if we did absolutely everything right, we're facing a really, really tragic future, and there's such a battle ahead. So
I just want to quickly say one more thing. I will promise I'll be quick. Is you talked about climate justice, and I want to sort of encourage everybody to really, really engage in understanding that all energy has pollution. All energy, there is no magic energy. And there are really important questions that we need to be confronting about whether we are going to repeat the climate injustices of the fossil fuel era in the clean energy era. And so whether that's how we cite these things, how we deal with indigenous rights, how we deal with the communities that are going to be polluted for decades to come that were fossil fuel? Do we put the green energy there to keep good jobs in those communities, or are they going to be left behind? Climate justice has to have that component. I mean, wind farms have harms too. They are much less, but they have harms too, and we need to really, I think, be thoughtful here in California, particularly, where we have so much diversity, and we frankly have, like in Southeast LA, some of the worst climate injustices in the nation. I think it's a really important place for us to lead in thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, Brian McLaren talks about some of that in his book. The book will come out in a couple months, and I highly recommend it for folks who are interested in this. You started to talk a little bit about racial justice, which is very much part of this conversation. And I'm cognizant of the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you 2 more questions, even though I have many. And then I want to open it up for a little Q&A. And so we'll just keep eyes. I know I want to just be cognizant of that. I gave a sermon some years ago on High Holy Days about reparations. It's rooted in a particular Mishnah, ancient Jewish code of law. It's a dispute between 2 rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, over what happens when someone builds a home with the foundation based on a beam that was stolen from your neighbor's backyard. And so Shammai says, if your home is built on a stolen foundation, you need to tear down the house, take the beam, and return it to your neighbor. And Hillel says that's incredibly impractical. It's a beautiful house. That would be very wasteful. Don't tear down the home, but you actually have to compensate your neighbor, not even for the value of what it was when you stole it, but for what it is now at the foundation of your home. And so I'm very invested in the conversation around reparations for Black Americans. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you think the federal government's responsibility is to Black Americans and to indigenous communities here to begin to address some of the many injustices that underlie the disparities in wealth, in health, and in treatment under the law.
So I think this is a really incredibly important discussion to be having, and so I want to commend you for leading your community and thinking about this. Reparations benefit all Americans. And I think that's a really important thing to say, because we're in this political moment driven in part by Trump and by the forces that he unleashed that were there, which is this politics of scarcity, which is if I get something, then you won't have it, right? And Democrats are bad about this too. I hate to say it, but I am willing to push my own party to do better. This idea that we'll do a little bit for this group and a little bit for that group and something for these people, and oh, it's June, we got to do something for LGBTQ, and then it's Pride Month. I mean, we need to do things that lift up all Americans with an eye to the fact that the lift will look different and be different in scale, scope, and size, depending on where they are starting. And where people are starting structurally is something that we all own. We all own that, right? And so reparations are something that by healing some of these things, by making every American have the opportunity to thrive, we are all better off. Mm-hmm. So we have to get out of this idea of thinking about reparations as something that we sort of do once and it makes it better and it sort of erases the past. And reparations are really an ongoing effort to achieve the kind of equality and justice that we believe our country should model. So I think Sheila Jackson Lee's bill to have a commission about this is important. I followed with interest the California Commission. I think there were some good things that came out of it and some things that maybe make the project more difficult that came out of it. But I also think that one of the projects that needs to go hand in hand with reparations is being willing to take a hard look at the policies we have been using to help and uplift and address the harms of the Black community. So, the reality is that education today is as or more segregated as it was before Brown versus Board of Education. Right? The reality is that decades of affirmative action, while they help many amazing individuals thrive, don't solve the fact that the deep inequities in our schooling that begin at birth have not been addressed. So I think one of the things that reparations should call us all to do is to really dig deep on what the policy solutions might look like. I think, kind of thinking about more in the buckets we have, there is no doubt that communities of color, especially Black and Indigenous communities, have not received the level of funding that is commensurate with what they need, even on a per capita basis, much less what they need to actually flourish. But I also think I want to think about policies that are better than what we've been doing. I don't know that just more of always the same is going to get us where we want to go. So I think about the benefits of things like college for all, right? Which gives us all a stake in making sure that Black Americans can achieve the same educational outcomes that white people have. It doesn't mean you won't have to deliver that policy differently to make the outcome achievable and to get to the end goal. Because I think we've seen if you design policies and you claim that you are race blind, what you really are is reproducing systemic discrimination. And so I think we need policies that are really thoughtful about how they will be delivered, how they will affect Black and Indigenous communities in order to get there.
Okay, thank you for that. We're going to go to questions in a moment, but I want to talk a little bit about Israel and about this war and the shifting ground that we're on right now. And I've spent a good amount of time in the last 3 months talking to other elected officials who feel like I went into this business because I wanted to build affordable housing, and now all of a sudden I'm expected to know exactly the right way to nuance my statement about Hamas and about Israel, and how do I deal with this? And it's not really what drove most American elected officials into office in the first place, but you are also on the front lines now in many ways. And I'm thinking of one elected in particular who told me that she found her face on a poster with words terrorist underneath, and then she found her face on a poster with genocider underneath. And she's like, literally everyone thinks I'm getting it wrong. And, again, I just want to build housing. So I am wondering if you can tell us, as a community that's really, obviously, we're in deep sorrow and anguish and great concern about what's going on over there in this, and both October 7th and also the aftermath of the atrocities. If you can, and this ongoing war, if you can tell us how you are navigating this impossible discourse, and a little bit about what you see as the role of Congress in trying to address this in a way that will have a meaningful impact on the people whose lives are being affected on the ground every day.
Yeah. This is better and continues to be literally each day, each morning, when I look at the news, an incredibly heartbreaking situation for the hostages that are still there, for who are healing, and those who have been released who are healing from trauma, for the soldiers who are serving in the IDF and their families, for the people of Gaza who are dying, including children. This is a really, really heartbreaking situation. I think you said, people are like, well, I didn't want to work on this issue. Well, I didn't want to work on President Trump, but there he came, right? So I think you tough is what I would say to that person. We have a duty, all of us, I think, as Americans, when we're seeing this kind of human suffering, to dig in, to educate ourselves, to learn, to think collectively and individually about what might end this conflict, what might be a better future for the people of Gaza and for the state of Israel. And so, I will say that I sympathize with the story you told about everybody's mad at you. I think I have felt that sometimes. I think that's a dynamic to some degree, even in this particular Senate race. I am really proud of the position that I've tried to stake out, which is one that is really focused on how do we create better lives for the people of Gaza and the people of Israel. We have to be able to, and it sounds simple, but a lot of my colleagues can't articulate that as a goal. They won't even articulate that the pain and the suffering is across the region, right? I mean, this is a terrible, terrible time for Israelis. It is a terrible, terrible time for the people of Gaza and the people of the West Bank too, and to the diaspora, both Jewish and Palestinian around the world. So I think one of the things is I've been trying to push us to think about how do you get to a ceasefire? It is not as easy as saying the word. There's a lot of political pressure for people to be, in quote, in favor of a ceasefire. Who is not in favor of a ceasefire? We should all want this conflict to end. That doesn't answer the question about how, when, on what terms, with what sort of boundaries do we put on that ceasefire to keep the violence at bay and to create a better future. I think the role of the United States as an ally to Israel is to push Israel to answer some of these questions. I think we need to both support Israel and help it in things like negotiating for the return of the hostages, but also press them on sort of, are your actions in the West Bank in this moment making Israel safer, right? Or is there short-term political gain and long-term security risk that's being created by what you're doing? And so I think, this concept to me of standing with Israel isn't a kind of passive standing behind. It is a standing with. It is an active kind of constant conversation and dialogue. And you have to be willing to have that conversation and dialogue with people who are losing family members, who are worried about what's happening in Gaza. And so I've been really proud that on October 8th, I had a town hall at my mosque. That was a hard place to walk into. And I did it. And I think what most concerns me about this moment politically is people are just basically saying, like, the goal is to say nothing. Mm-hmm. The goal is to think nothing. The goal is to, no matter what you say, you're going to be in trouble. Because there's some real truth to that. I have seen those exact same, I have had newspaper headlines that I am anti-Semitic. I have had red paint smeared all over my front yard saying that I am a genocidal murderer. And so how do you anchor and kind of care for yourself in this moment? I think a lot of us in Congress are really struggling with that because we're trying to think about what does leadership mean in this moment. And for me, a lot of what leadership has meant is helping people who disagree to be in conversation with each other. I mean, I represent Orange County. So I've got a third Republicans, a third Democrats, and a third kind of we hate everybody, no party preference voters. And how I win in this community and how I bring these communities together is through a lot of conversation, a lot of sharing of facts, a lot of dialogue, and a lot of being willing to take the political risk of having the conversation. Mm. And in this moment, even having a conversation is perceived to be choosing a side. And I think that is so problematic. So, when we're seeing, I'm sure you're seeing here in LA, deep strains on our interfaith community, which has been such an important part of how we've been able to address anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, hatred generally. The fabric of that community is really being strained by this conflict, and I think will take a while to repair. So some of the concrete things that interest me most, I would like to see Israel and the United States affirmatively develop a plan to rebuild Gaza. And to begin to fund that now, and to think about not just rebuilding the hard infrastructure, but how are we going to rebuild the soft infrastructure, the education system, the system of leadership? I don't think it's adequate for Israel to say, well, there's no good leaders. That That is certainly true if we're talking about Hamas. They are not. They should not ever be in power, ever again. But then what? And what is the role of Israel in cultivating and creating a kind of, as a neighbor, as someone who cares about people? And so I think of myself as a progressive Zionist, and I think that has been a lonely place to be politically. And so that was part of the reason I was excited to come here in conversation today. But one of you said before we started, where is the place that you can think about how to create a better future for Israel and the people of Palestine, for Israelis and Palestinians? Where is that place? And I said, well, I can tell you where it's not. Congress. So we are not even having the debate in Congress about these issues. What we are having is a lot of silencing. And I think that, for me, is the most domestically, as I think about what the domestic consequences are of this horrible international conflict, the silencing, the political lesson here is don't engage.
I mean, that's really tragic. And we've been talking a lot in our community about the kind of false binaries of this moment. And that the response to the toxic binary space is say nothing, do nothing, is really problematic. And so I really appreciate what you're saying. And we've been using the language of like creating third way spaces where we can actually talk about what our core values are. Unfortunately, they don't often fit on flags and on, T-shirts. It's hard to articulate what those core values and core commitments are. But I'm going to quote Daniel Sokach, who's one of the founders of IKAR and runs the New Israel Fund, but he says, like, we always safeguard our core values. Our core values are the same regardless of what the externals are. And so I really appreciate that. I will say, from my perspective, that I really hope that representatives in Congress will really push and advance a conversation about a long-term negotiated solution and an end to this conflict. We have to really cast our gaze to a future in which two peoples can live in two states side by side. I know that dream seemed dead to many people for many years, but now I think it's become clear to many of us once again that this is really the only way, and we have to deal with the immediate.
Dead, then what?
Then what, right. So, and I want to just say one more thing here, and then we're going to just take 2 or 3 comments from the community. So if you have questions, and Elise is around, and we'll, hi Elise, and thank you for everything. I also want to say, I spoke a little bit this morning about anti-Semitism, and among many of the things that we've discussed here. And I'm really, I'm grateful for your attention to it and awareness of what's going on. And I believe we have to take this very, very seriously. I'm also deeply concerned about the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And I use that word carefully. I mean, people throw around weaponization a lot, but I actually think that we've seen a lot of this lately. And I don't think that it keeps my family safer. I don't think it keeps our community safer. And so I want to be careful that, especially in these conversations in Congress, that when we're talking about fighting anti-Semitism, that conversation is being held in a way that will actually keep Jews safer rather than advance some kind of like anti-woke agenda or something, which I think ultimately actually endangers all of us and endangers our democracy. So with that, I'm going to see, well, literally we can only take a couple of comments. So I'm going to start with Adam Weissman over here, because he's one of the leaders of our justice work at IKAR, and also a board member with a really beautiful baby. And so we'll start with you, Adam.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I have another super easy question for you. So in addition to volunteering for IKAR, I'm a TV writer. I want to thank you for coming to our picket lines. So I think that strike and all the strikes we have are the result of monopolistic, anti-competitive behavior by corporations, and that seems to be a rare area of bipartisan agreement. And we've seen the DOJ and the FTC fail to, get verdicts in antitrust cases. So what can be done in Congress to curb that behavior by corporations?
Yes. I love this question, because the question I've always wanted to be asked and never have been is, what's the sexiest, coolest thing President Biden's done? And nobody ever asked me that. And so the answer is actually the topic of his question, which is for me, the thing you don't know about President Biden that is the most amazing thing about his policies are the way that he has attempted to dismantle really 50 years of corporate consolidation and monopolistic corporate abuse. And it is not always successful. There have been setbacks in that. But we are at least having a conversation about antitrust, about monopoly power, about corporate consolidation that we weren't even having even 5 or 6 years ago. And so I think we are making progress. I will say it's an interesting issue. There is bipartisan support, that is, there are Democrats and Republicans who are interested in thinking about how do we revisit our monopoly laws? Do we have the right tests? Do we have the right standards? Do we have the right remedies when there is antitrust? Most of our antitrust law was written in the 1930s, so it's really old and has not been revisited. Interestingly, there are also a huge number of Republicans and a very sizable chunk of Democrats who don't want to talk about this. So the divide in Congress on this is a divide between people like me who ran for Congress, never taking corporate PAC money, pledging from day one, have never taken that, never will. Like, my bread and butter is speaking truth, holding powerful people to account. I don't care if what you're a CEO of. If you're hurting American people, we're going to be talking about it in a hearing soon. And there are Republicans who actually are willing to do that too. But there are an awful lot of Republicans and a good chunk of Democrats who say, well, like, Amazon doesn't want me to do that. And that's a lot of Congress, right? So we do have a movement, but I would say it's not at the tipping point yet politically in terms of Congress really being willing to engage on this issue. So we've had some legislative ideas, but they have not gotten a vote. If they have gotten a vote, it has been like with assurances, I'll vote for that so long as you promise me it dies in the Senate. Kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, which is really disingenuous. And so I think probably congressional action will be needed to think about this. But I would also say one of the things I think we're making progress on is understanding that monopolies are not just in big tech. We have a bread monopoly in this country. Did you know that? 40% of all bread is made by one company. We have a cereal monopoly. I mean, it's actually really hard to think of an area, an industry, where we don't have either a risk or a reality of monopoly power. So I think this will require probably congressional action. I also think it will involve a Supreme Court that isn't corrupt by corporate power, and as sort of appointing some judges who are willing to take on big corporations.
Okay, we're going to just take 2 more questions, and then we'll have you both ask at once, and then how do I decide? Susan, Elise, let's just, I think Louis has a hand, and then Peggy. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, we got our next 2. Okay, you can both ask, and then you can answer both at once. Are you okay?
We should ask.
I wanted to ask you a question. If we don't diagnose the problem, how can we find a solution? And we're all touching it around really nicely. We are a more than 200 years old empire. And historically, empires rise and fall. And you're saying about the permits and how much we need reform to streamline. I wanted to point out to how the state of Israel of the time that my parents came to Israel solved the housing problem. They went from the solution to the solution first. No Jewish person who survived the Holocaust will live outdoors. So they started with tents and simple buildings, nothing fancy. But 1 million people came to Israel since 1950 and absorbed by 600,000 poor Jewish people. In other words, it's possible to do it. So how do we get inspired to make the change that we need to make.
Great.
And we see the crippling, pushing the solution to others like education and housing. Those are basics. That's how you grow ignorant people who will vote the way they vote. So can you diagnose it for us, please?
Thank you. And let's just take the second question now, and then we'll have you address both of them at once.
This builds on something, Congresswoman, you mentioned earlier about being forward-looking, and something the rabbi mentioned in her sermon today about trying to reframe in our own lives questions about what keeps us up at night into questions about why we get up in the morning. I have always taken affirmativeness as the core of empowerment in politics, and I'm hearing a lot of that coming from you. I think that's something that our political system pushes back against, and I'm sorry, I'm going to use my phone just to read a quote from my friend who is much smarter than me on these. He says, "What are you proud of is often a more productive question to ask someone to understand their politics than who do you hate? Who do you hate is extremely illustrative, just not very productive." So, Congresswoman, I'm hopeful that in whatever domain you like, maybe as part of your answer to the previous gentleman's question, you'll tell us a little bit about what you're proud of, what you believe America should be proud of, what you want the America that you're in the Senate to lead will be proud of when you're done, and how that pride should be shared across this country, urban, rural, Jew, Muslim, black, white.
Super easy questions, super quick answers. Let me start with a concrete thing that I'm really proud of, and I think it illustrates some of what I want to accomplish. There was a moment in the pandemic early on where there was much less no care protocols, there was no testing, there was no ability to figure out if you even had COVID or not. And I went back and forth with the director of this CDC for my 5 allotted minutes. And at about 5 minutes and 10 seconds in, right as my buzzer was going off, I got him to agree to say yes, that he would make COVID testing free for every single American. Now, the remarkable thing about that to me is that I didn't have to make any law. We had a law on the books written for just this kind of a public health emergency that allowed the CDC director to make this kind of decision and determination. And so I think, for me, what I'm most proud of is sometimes it's about sometimes the affirmative action that we need to be taking sometimes it's reinvention and it's thinking of new things, but sometimes it's picking up things and expecting them to work. And we have a lot of that in government where we're like, well, of course that doesn't work. That program doesn't work, this program doesn't work. Some of these programs do work, and we ought to be figuring out which ones do and investing more in them, right? This was the big argument for the child tax credit. That program works. The early research on universal basic income suggests that program works better than the whole host of things we've built around it. And so I think for me, it's been willing to press people to kind of use the tools that they have. So if you're a CEO, you have tremendous ability to influence the outcomes of your workers' lives, but also of the children of your workers and of the community where you have your headquarters or your factory or your retail. Are you using that power? So I think for me, it's been not about sort of my power, I passed this, I did this. I'm proud of those things, but it's more about pressing others in as honest of a way as I can to use the power that they have, that I think is a really important tool of leadership that I think we've lost a little bit in this kind of narcissistic, like, here's all the things I've done. Sometimes the greatest thing you can do is to prompt somebody else to be their best self, right? And I think that's a kind of leadership too. In answer to your question, I mean, I hate to flounder here at the end, but I don't really know where to fully start there. I do think that we need research-based policies. I think that we've lost our way. One of the things Washington really needs is ideas. And that might sound like a small task, but it's really not. One of the hardest things for me about being new to Congress, and I've been there 5 years, I've been through a couple of impeachments, an insurrection, the longest shutdown in government history, a war in the Middle East. I mean, and I've been there 5 years. This is my 5-year anniversary, like a couple days ago. Is what we don't have a lot of is new ideas. So one of the hardest things is when you say to people like, I want to work on childcare. I got to Congress, I really wanted to work on childcare, bringing down the cost of childcare without pushing caregivers deeper and deeper into the poverty they're already struggling with, particularly women of color. And what I was told was like, well, that's so-and-so's issue. You should talk to so-and-so. So I went and talked to so-and-so, and they said, well, yes, I have a great bill on that. I've introduced it in every Congress since 1992. And it's like, well, how's that working out for you? Like, we have to be willing to kind of have that debate within our party. And I think one of the things that is most difficult about this moment is, I would say 90%, maybe 95% of the political dialogue is about what's wrong with the other party and what's better about us. Mm-hmm. And I spend almost all of my time talking about what the problems are in our country and how we can solve them. Because I actually want Republicans to be part of the solution. And I'm not confident they always will be, but that has to be our aspiration. And so I think that's something that it's a way for me of being able to be deeply progressive and yet deeply nonpartisan. And I think that is, I'm a little bit of a unicorn. Like, you're not supposed to be able to be progressive and win in a place like Newport Beach. Mm-hmm. But like, I think that's something that we need to find our way to in terms of how we need to solve problems, is to be willing to not compromise on what we want to achieve, but to be deeply willing to compromise on who we talk to about it, mm-hmm. who we listen to about it, who we learn from about it, who we bring into the solving of the problem.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is incredible, enlightening, inspiring. I want to just close by, I bless you with strength, with continued moral clarity, with continued creativity and imagination. We're very grateful for your voice in Congress. Before everyone gets up, I just want to ask, can our Minyan Tzedek leadership just rise for a moment? I want everyone to get eyes on past and present. We'll decide about the future. So if you have questions about how to get involved in our justice work, and a few people did ask me this right after services, please come speak to any of these folks, and we'll help hook you into the work. But thank you so much for being the voice that you are. We're really deeply grateful. And Shabbat Shalom to all of you. May it be a week of peace. We're going to close with Birkat Hamazon, so please feel free to join me or get up and schmooze. And please help bust your plates, and thank you to our team that stayed late today so we could have this conversation.